History as it happens, October 10th, 2023. Nut House.
The office of Speaker of the House of the United States House of Representatives is hereby declared vacant.
I take no lecture on asking patriotic Americans to weigh in and contribute to this fight from those who would grovel and bend knee for the lobbyists and special interests who own our leadership, who have, boo all you want.
Right-wing Republicans have to solve the problems that right-wing Republicans create, okay? And so the civil war within the Republican Party has nothing to do with us.
There is no one. If you look at the names that have been talked about, whether it's Tom Emmer, Jim Jordan, all these others, they were all up there advocating on behalf of Kevin McCarthy.
You took a gamble to make sure government was still open. And 8 people can throw you out as speaker, and the Democrats who said they wanted to keep government open, I think you've got a real divide. I think you've got a real institutional problem.
The House of Representatives has no speaker after a contingent of right-wing Republicans instigated the ouster of Kevin McCarthy. It is the return of chaos in Congress. Political crackup is nothing new in Washington, but what does McCarthy's demise mean for the state of American democracy at a time when public confidence in government institutions is at or near historic lows? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I think what we're seeing is not unique to this moment. Maybe that's the obvious thing for a historian to say. We've had many other moments of complete dysfunction in the House of Representatives, and we're in one of those ugly moments again right now.
This episode's about U.S. domestic politics, so maybe you're wondering why I'm not doing something about the outbreak of war in the Middle East, the Hamas incursion into Israel that killed hundreds of civilians, and the Israeli retaliation that's underway, the biggest story in the world right now. That is a fair question. Well, I decided to take more time to understand what's going on there rather than rush an episode into production. My next 2 episodes will be about Israel and the Palestinians, the origins of Hamas, the possible Israeli-Saudi normalization. That is all coming up. Today we're going to focus on another timely and important story, what's going on in the House of Representatives.
Good afternoon. Today, as of noon, almost half of the federal government employees are idle. The government is partially shutting down.
November 1995, President Bill Clinton announces a government shutdown that would last 21 days.
Because Congress has failed to pass the straightforward legislation necessary to keep the government running without imposing sharp hikes in Medicare premiums and deep cuts in education and the environment. It is particularly unfortunate that the Republican Congress has brought us
the result of a budget impasse with House Speaker Newt Gingrich.
It's very difficult to know exactly how to proceed with so many factual errors in one statement. The president says he sent up a balanced budget. The fact is, scored by the budget office, his budget is $200 billion.
And all this didn't end very well for Gingrich.
For me to stay in the House would make it impossible for a new leader to have a chance to grow, to learn, and to do what they need to do.
My mind traveled back to the mid-1990s when I saw the ouster of Kevin McCarthy from the Speaker's office. Although I'm not sure Matt Gaetz is another Newt.
I take no lecture on asking patriotic Americans to weigh in and contribute to this fight from those who would grovel and bend knee for the lobbyists and special interests who own our leadership, who have, boo all you want, who have hollowed out this town and have borrowed against the future of our future generations. I'll be happy to fund my political operation through the work of hardworking Americans, $10 and $20 and $30 at a time, and you all keep showing up at the lobbyist fundraisers and see how that goes for you. I reserve.
Gaetz's antics did not have the support of many of his Republican colleagues in the House.
And yet, today we will spend the people's time so that someone can audition for a television show.
The comparison doesn't have to be perfect. The point is, the origins of today's right-wing populism, anti-government populism, might be traced to the 1990s and the scorched earth politics of people like Gingrich and Tom DeLay. Just take a step back from the minute-by-minute, hour-by-hour headlines of the GOP infighting. And you might see a larger pattern here, an antipathy toward democratic norms. Although some commentators say this is actually how democracy is supposed to work. It's messy. Well, I don't know. Many of the same people who were behind the fiasco of selecting McCarthy back in January are willing to shut down the government or threaten a federal debt default or claim Donald Trump actually won the 2020 election. Jeremi Suri is a scholar at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin and is the author of Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. And as you know, he is a regular on the podcast. Jeremi Suri, welcome back.
Good to be with you, Martin.
I love having you on because I can talk to you about the 21st century, the 20th century, the 19th century, tie them all together to make sense of what's going on. I mean, can anyone make sense of what's going on in the House of Representatives right now?
Well, I mean, this is why historians are important, I think, because we can put these different eras together. And I think what we're seeing is not unique to this moment. Maybe that's the obvious thing for a historian to say. We've had many other moments of complete dysfunction in the House of Representatives, and we're in one of those ugly moments again right now.
Is it dysfunction? Let me play devil's advocate. By the way, I do agree with that. This is dysfunctional. But some would say, this is just democracy being messy and a political party trying to work itself out.
No, I don't think so, because I think this is a case where you have a very small group of individuals who represent a very, very small part of the American public, probably less than 2%, who are dictating to a party. They're dictating policy to that party, and they're then preventing that party from moving forward and making the compromises that must be made. Democracy is about compromise. In a democracy, especially a two-party system like the United States, you can go from left to right to middle and left to right again, but you have to make compromises. That's what especially any budget, any continuing resolution, any funding mechanism is.
All right, before we get further into that, I'm going to just make a couple of points. One, to our listeners. So they probably have figured out by now that I do my interviews a couple days, sometimes even more than that, before the podcast actually makes it out into the ether. So just keep that in mind. By the time you're listening to this, there might be a new Speaker of the House of Representatives. There may not be. And number two, I want to actually start with a quiz. And I need to admit that I did not know the answers to these questions either. So, Jeremi Suri, you're a great historian. However, if you don't know the answers here, I won't blame you because these are obscure figures.
Okay.
CNN.com has an article about how historically short was the McCarthy speakership.
Okay, so this is like Quiz Bowl right now. Okay, let's do it.
It's a short quiz. It's only really one question. McCarthy was the third shortest speakership in American history. Who were the other two that were shorter?
Oh, gosh. The other shorter speakerships, right? Because so many of them lasted for so long. Joe Cannon, Nancy Pelosi, Tip O'Neill. Other shorter ones. I guess Dennis Hastert was not shorter, was it?
No. These guys are from the 19th century.
Okay, I have to confess.
I never heard of the shortest one ever. Theodore Pomeroy, 1869. He was speaker for one day. He just simply was the speaker on the very final day of that Congress.
Okay.
And the second shortest, coming in at 257 days, Michael C. Kerr, 1875 to 76. He died in office.
Yeah, I have seen his name. I don't know much about it.
I don't know
I've
anything
seen
about
his
it.
name.
McCarthy, 269 days. So really, McCarthy's kind of the shortest one because you really can't count these other guys. The other guy died. One guy was there only one day. Yeah, to your point about typically being longer recently, Nancy Pelosi, 2,918 days. Paul Ryan, 1,162 days by comparison. Again, that was from CNN.com, Christopher Hickey.
And I do think others, I'm sure, have heard this, and it's true that McCarthy's the first to be voted out by his own caucus in this way.
Comparisons can be interesting. Sometimes I don't know if they're all that helpful. It's very easy to try to go back into history to try to figure out, what's going on today. Can we find examples? You told me that what happened to McCarthy, this fiasco, reminded you of the congressional divisions in the 1860s and 1870s. What did you mean by that?
So after the Civil War, and particularly after 1868-69, when the Confederate States come back into the Union, when they're readmitted to the Union and they start sending Democrats to Congress, you have a similar dynamic because you have a portion of the Democratic Party from some of the former Confederate states that is made up of anti-Reconstruction, anti-civil rights members, but you also have African-American members from those states as well. And this includes states like Mississippi, where you have a contingent of African-American representatives and you have a contingent of, shall we say, unreconstructed white Confederates. That small group of Democrats in particular who are opposed to all civil rights, who are opposed to all federal government intervention, they act in ways that to me look very similar to Matt Gaetz and Andy Biggs and others who are the far right of the Republican Party today. The position of those Democrats in the late 1860s and early 1870s is to blow the government up, to stop the government from functioning, because if the government doesn't function, the government can't enforce the law in their own states. And particularly when Ulysses Grant creates the Justice Department, and this is where there's a really interesting parallel. The Justice Department was created in 1870-71. They tried to use their influence in Congress to prevent the Justice Department from functioning, which seems to me to be a very similar element to what we have today.
Yeah, we've seen political crack-up before. I mean, the antebellum Democrats, prior to the Civil War, they split over slavery. I think they even held two separate conventions, did they?
That's correct.
Yeah,
That's correct.
Also, the Democrats cracked up in 1968. No two instances are alike, right? But I think these examples can teach us that, a party can go through a really rough time, but then out of the ashes, something better can come out of that. I don't know.
That's true, but it usually happens when one side wins and another side gives in a sense. So the classic case of this that's more recent is just what you referred to, the Democratic Party in the 1960s. I would start that story in 1964 when the Mississippi Free Democrats go to Atlantic City to the Democratic Convention. These are Mississippi Democrats or African Americans who are claiming that they've been disenfranchised in the state, and they want to be seated at the convention, and Lyndon Johnson refuses to seat them in 64. That starts a long rebellion among civil rights activists within the Democratic Party, which is part of the story of 68, which is about Vietnam and civil rights. But it moves the Democratic Party, and it's the beginning of the Democratic Party we see today, which is much more representative of traditionally disenfranchised groups. So that faction wins. Even Lyndon Johnson himself, who was opposed to that faction in 64, later comes to see that that is actually the direction the party has to go in. The Republicans have not shown any determination to move forward. They're still in that 1964 moment. They're mired in their factional debates, and there's one figure outside the party or one figure outside of Congress who seems to be manipulating things from the outside.
That would be
Donald Trump.
Well, you're right. Usually if you lose repeatedly in the recent history of the Republican Party here, right, that would be incentive to change. Now, remember that 2012 postmortem, I think it was 2012. That was the Romney election.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, whatever happened to that? I mean, I guess, well, they won in 2016, so... But they've been losing since is the point, right?
Well, and let's be clear. The Republican Party has lost the national popular vote in every presidential election except for one since 1988. They've managed to get people into the presidency, but they have lost the popular vote. That is not a long-term winning strategy for a party.
Is this simply a problem of 20 radical Republicans, 20 or so in the House? These are the ones who almost forced a shutdown of the government.
There have always been crazies in the House, and probably there are no more today than there were in some of these other periods. What's different is that you have part of the Republican base that is motivated to encourage these individuals, and you have a whole media ecosystem. These are topics I know you've discussed very well on your podcast, which I listen to. So I know you've covered these issues with people like Nikki Hemmer and others. Yeah. So there's a whole Steve Bannon, Fox News. Now that's not even the most radical, right? Newsmax, whatever. There's a whole ecosystem encouraging this. And then there's a whole group of people in the party who are no way representative of the party, but over-participate in the rallies, over-participate in some of the primaries, and quite frankly, continue to give money to people like Matt Gaetz. That's what pulls these radicals into more powerful roles than what they would have otherwise.
Yeah, with a split House, 20 people can be the difference between getting something done or not.
So that's the irony of this, right? So the House is more closely split after the 2022 election because the right wing put up some horrible candidates in what should have been an election where the Republicans did much better, a midterm election with a not very popular president of the other party. They did poorly because of the radical influence, but that then gave the radicals, the extremes in the party, more influence, even though they caused that because it was a narrower majority. But it is worth saying that Nancy Pelosi had exactly the same narrow majority on the Democratic side, and she didn't have these difficulties.
Yeah.
So there is something about the Republican Party's internal divisions that's empowering these individuals in a way it doesn't in the Democratic Party. 10 years ago, we thought this was more a Democrat problem, right? We talked about the Democratic Party being pulled by extremes. It's quite clear. I don't think anyone can argue now. The Republican Party is the party that's much more pulled apart by its extremes.
And as you say, there are incentives to change course here, losing elections, just the simple unpopularity of what they're pushing. Government shutdowns. I don't think the impeachment of Joe Biden, this impeachment inquiry, is very popular outside of the far right, that is. You know, a lot of what they're proposing here is not what working class people are concerned about.
That's exactly right. They've set themselves on a road to lose their majority. Kevin McCarthy, as Speaker, had a very important role, as any Speaker does, in raising money for the caucus. And when you take down your Speaker, you take down your key fundraiser. There was supposed to be a very big Republican fundraising event, a big annual event in Dallas, and they had to cancel it and tell all their big donors not to show up. And there's no doubt that the people with money, who are the majority of the donors in the party still, are sitting on the sidelines while this is going on. The Democrats are raising money off of this. So this is in no way a strategy to continue and hold your majority.
I mean, the irony here is that most Republicans actually didn't want to get rid of McCarthy. Only 8, right, were the ones who instigated this, and all the Democrats voted with them. Did Democrats miscalculate there?
Not at all. It seems to me actually silly to say the Democrats should have voted with McCarthy. The Democrats were the majority of the votes for the continuing resolution to keep the government open. And as far as we can tell, there's been no evidence that McCarthy coordinated with them at all. He sprung that on them at the last minute, and they voted for it because they wanted to keep the government open. It appears that he actually thought they might vote against it, and then he could blame them for closing the government.
He did on the next Sunday shows, too, which ticked off. Yeah. Go ahead.
And of course, that didn't help. But here's the thing. After that, it was clear that he was going to need Democratic votes to keep his speakership. And he did call Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic Party leader in the House, and he offered him nothing. No one in politics gives you their vote for nothing. He has never done that for the Democrats. Why would they keep him in power and then allow him to cater to the far right, which is what he probably would have done? He made promises to the Democrats repeatedly that he broke. He promised there would be a vote before any impeachment inquiry. There wasn't. He promised the President of the United States that there was a deal when we had the debt limit crisis a few months ago, and he went back on his word. Why should they believe, the Democrats, that he would do anything for them? This is an internal Republican issue. They have the majority. They have to figure this out. They cannot spend their time condemning the Democrats and then ask the Democrats to come in and save their bacon.
And it seems that chaos is the point behind all of this stuff. The debt default, the government shutdown, the impeachment inquiry, then ousting McCarthy himself. I mean, none of this is really advancing any kind of positive agenda.
I think it's also personal attention. I think someone like Matt Gaetz gets interviewed and we talk about him, and that's what he wants.
And as you say, dysfunction, too. It brings on dysfunction because they don't want the government to actually function. And that leads me to my next point. Did you read the book How Democracies Die by Levitsky and Ziblatt?
I did indeed. It's a very good book. I've assigned it to students, too.
So they offer 4 key indicators for what they say is, the slide into authoritarianism. This may not be authoritarianism, what we just saw in the House of Representatives, but it certainly is dysfunction. But my point here is that I think what we're seeing, if we scale back and put this into a broader perspective and invoke some history, antipathy toward democracy. 4 key indicators: rejection of democratic rules of the game, denial of legitimacy of political opponents, to wit, you compromise with Democrats, well, then you're out. Toleration or encouragement of violence, readiness to curtail civil liberties of opponents, including the media.
The only thing I would add, because I do think those are pretty good indicators, and I do think the Republican Party has a very strong authoritarian streak right now, not just from the far right, by the way. But I think what we really have to work into this conversation is the fear that others have the numbers. So it's not just anti-democracy, it's actually a belief that they can't win. And you do see this, again, if I go back to the period after the Civil War, this is the argument that's made by the Democrats then, that if there's really a fair election, there's no way. Ben Tillman says this in South Carolina, governor and senator from South Carolina, Strom Thurmond's predecessor. We can't let all these other people vote because if they vote, they're always going to get their way and we won't get our way. It's not as if people who make that argument think they're anti-democratic. It's a question of democracy for whom.
Yeah.
And that's really what we're dealing with here. This is a party that is catering to a small group that feels disenfranchised, and they're trying to enfranchise them by disenfranchising the majority.
Yeah, it's an antipathy to real democracy, multiracial democracy. I think in their book they make the point that no nation has, well, I'll find it here, citing a political scientist who made this observation. No country has ever built a multi-ethnic democracy in which no particular ethnic group is in the majority and where society has achieved political, social, and economic equality. What I'm struggling with here is, how do we get to a more normal politics after something like this? But the destruction of Reconstruction, we didn't get a normal politics. We got wide-scale disenfranchisement. So peace came at a really serious cost.
That's true. And so that's in some ways why Reconstruction is not the model for us. But I think what we do see in the early 20th century in some areas, not on race relations, and what we certainly see after World War II, is one side wins and the other side adjusts. So the Republican Party of Dwight Eisenhower is very different, actually, from the Republican Party of Warren Harding. And Eisenhower still considers himself a very strong Republican, but he's moved on many issues. Look at the Interstate Highway Act, the amount of federal money that's put into that. It's a New Deal-style project from the Republicans, emphasizing economic growth rather than redistribution of income. But it is accepting some of the premises from the New Deal. The same is true following the Progressive era, right? It is the Republican Party that pushes for things like child labor laws, protections for workers. This is Theodore Roosevelt and the Republican Party doing this, and that gets adopted by the Democratic Party. So what has to happen is on some issues, the Republican Party has to get rid of its extremes and move toward a more moderate position where it adopts some of the Democratic policies, but then comes back to its Republican core issues of fiscal conservatism, for example. So Ukraine is not the battle the Republicans want to fight. I mean, it seems crazy to me that they want to shut the government down over Ukraine. We can have an argument. I think you and I, Martin, differ slightly on U.S. policy toward Ukraine, but I think we also agree that that's not the issue to shut the government down on.
For these changes to happen, it would take Republicans acting or at least acknowledging that they have lost. Now, they do have the majority in the House, but they don't control the whole government.
So here's the missed opportunity that McCarthy could have pursued to keep his speakership. It's not waiting for the Democrats to just vote and save him when he's given them nothing. That never will happen, and the Republicans never would have done that for the Democrats. But he could have, when he called Jeffries, he could have actually said, here are some things we agree on. I will help you on these issues if you vote for me. And he could have become the first, well, not the first, but one of the first speakers to actually be speaker because he has the majority of his caucus and significant votes in the other caucus. It's so rare, Martin, that I use Texas as a positive example for anything. But in this case, that is how the House works in Texas. The House versus the Senate in Texas, the House is much more bipartisan. There's a long tradition in the House in Texas of a Republican speaker making certain Democrats committee chairs. And there's an effort that the speaker gets votes from the other party as well as his own. McCarthy could have done that, and the Democrats might have been open to that. Yeah. But here's the thing. He offered them nothing. He learned nothing from Lyndon Johnson. You cannot get the other side to help you if you don't give them some of what they want.
I think just in society, across society, people don't want to view their political opponents as having any legitimacy at all, don't want to be around them, don't want to talk to them.
I think that's public performance, and I think some people do feel that way. What is striking to me is when you talk not to the extreme members of either caucus, but when you talk to the average member of Congress or the Senate, and I've talked to many of them myself, I'm sure you have, you're in Washington, They actually do get along and think many of those on the other side are legitimate, but then they feel they have to perform in a certain way. I'll give a very clear example. I've gotten to know a little bit our senior Senator John Cornyn, who I think much more highly of than our junior senator in Texas, who I won't name. John Cornyn I've been at events with him that are truly bipartisan events, and he's thoughtful. Not only is he cordial, he listens, that you can have a serious, substantive, policy-focused conversation with John Cornyn and someone from the other side. But you don't see that on TV.
Yeah. You've made this point on the show. As a matter of fact, the last time you were on with Jeffrey Engel, we were talking about some of the origins of this anti-government populism today. Your point was there's a lot more consensus in our society that does not show up in our politics.
That's right. That's right. And the problem is what's incentivized in our media system and what's incentivized in our primary system and in fundraising is being outrageous. Indicted figures seem to make money off of, yelling at the judge who's indicted them.
Well, speaking of that, I want to get your take on something that was actually in a New York Times newsletter, the other Times. New York Times newsletter with the headline, America's Political Turmoil. This is a good segue because I actually wanted to ask you about how this would affect foreign policy. It says, imagine if you were a foreign leader surveying the political chaos in the United States. For the first time in history, party has ousted its own speaker in the middle of a term. In the Senate, one of the two party leaders, who is 81 years old, has twice recently frozen in public, unable to speak, referring to McConnell. A Supreme Court justice has allowed wealthy political donors to finance a lavish lifestyle for him and his wife, talking about Clarence Thomas. A likely nominee in the upcoming presidential election is facing 4 criminal trials and regularly speaks in apocalyptic terms about the country's future. And that nominee is essentially tied in the polls with an 80-year-old president who many voters worry is too old to serve a second term. We also have the Menendez scandal, where he refuses to resign after being indicted on very serious allegations of corruption. If you are a foreign leader and you look at this, sometimes I wonder about those, if we do this, we're going to look weak in the face of whoever's opinion. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with what you were just starting to say. I think this is misguided and overblown by the New York Times. These are serious issues, don't get me wrong. But foreign leaders are accustomed to seeing a mess that they don't fully understand in the United States. There was a lot of concern after Watergate that this would undermine American standing in the world. Not really. You can find a few cases, but not really. There was a lot of concern after the 2000 election that this would be a problem. Generally, especially our friends overseas, they recognize the continuity and the professionalism of American foreign policy and military actors on a day-to-day basis. And it is that professionalism that matters. These issues in Congress are going on, but our foreign policy moves on. There's a continuity and professionalism in American politics that I think on a day-to-day basis is what governs the intersections between foreign countries. And the president matters. And this is a president who works well with his foreign allies. The one issue I think that has shaken our allies and perhaps also empowered our adversaries is the Donald Trump factor.
And the Ukraine funding issue as well. Right?
Correct, correct. But even there, I think so far they're pretty confident. We'll see what happens in 40 some odd days when we get to the next continuing resolution. But I think what I've heard and what I've seen that is a little different from the past is the concern that you could get someone elected to office in 2024 who would side with one of our biggest adversaries and undermine some of our key alliances like NATO. That's different, but I think that's what worries people abroad, not the day-to-day dysfunction of Congress. They've seen that before. And they have those issues within their own countries, by the way. These are not unique problems to the United States.
As I mentioned before, we've been very messy for a very long time, not to make light of this ridiculous dysfunction that we're seeing now in one of our two main political parties. But, you could make the case that the United States wasn't a true representative democracy until at least the 1960s.
And for all of the dysfunction that we have, and that is true, and this should lead us not to think we have the answers for other societies. Other societies look at us and they compare us to what else? What other system? Is the Chinese system really a preferable system? Is the German system now, which functions in some ways very well, but has a rising right-wing party, a right-wing party that's actually in the Bundestag right now and is going to win leadership in various states within Germany. I mean, that's not necessarily a better system either. So it's always in comparison to what?
The Russian model? Yeah. Sorry, no thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess in sum, things are as bad as they look, but they're also not as bad as they look. This thing about our democracy being in its death throes. I mean, I say yes and no, depending on which day of the week you're talking to me, right?
Well, I don't think we're anywhere near being in our death throes, and I think we're in a better situation than we were a few years ago for all kinds of reasons. And let's also remember that for the serious economic issues we still have, our economy is outperforming any peer. Right now, and economic bread and butter issues matter, right? Without the economic issues around Weimar Germany, you don't get the Nazi Party, right? So economic issues always matter. They're not determinative, and we're in a good position on those issues. We are in a situation, though, right now where we face a real problem in the day-to-day functioning of our government and the things that will need to be done in the next 2 months. That's not going to be the end of our democracy, but we're in for some rough times, especially if the Republican caucus cannot come together and find a way to keep the government open.
Yeah, we need two viable political parties.
We need two viable parties, and we need to create guardrails again. And one guardrail should be that you don't shut down the government. You don't have to agree to the other side's budget. You can pass a continuing resolution and continue arguing. That is fine. But you should not shut down the government. You should not tell FAA workers, TSA workers, soldiers that they have to show up for work and not be paid. And by the way, it's doubly bad. I was talking to a few individuals about this the other day. If the government closes, many federal employees are told to stay home. They don't get paid while they stay home, but then they get back pay for those days. So when we shut down the government, we're actually telling hundreds of thousands of people not to work, and then we pay them for not working. Yeah. What could be less fiscally conservative than that?
And Levitsky and Ziblatt made this point about what was going on in the 90s, which I think is really the historical origins of what we're seeing now, that scorched earth politics of Tom DeLay and Newt Gingrich. They said it was perfectly fine for Gingrich to not want to negotiate the budget with Clinton, but it was not okay to shut the government down over it. And they also said the impeachment of Clinton was a farce as well. And, we see echoes of that now. The impeachment of Joe Biden for things he may have done when he was vice president.
That leads to actually a lot of Democratic victories. The Republicans pursue a strategy under Gingrich that changes the way Congress operates, but in the short run, it actually helps Bill Clinton. It helps the person they're attacking. So part of what they need to understand is what they're doing is counterproductive.
As I said to somebody today, I'm not sure who put Matt Gaetz in charge of Congress.
Kevin McCarthy.
Well, that's
the
right.
Thing.
Yes.
He agreed to these rules, right? He agreed to rules that empowered an individual. There's a reason this never happened to Nancy Pelosi. There were people in the Democratic caucus who hated Nancy Pelosi as much as Matt Gaetz hates Kevin McCarthy. But they couldn't get away with this, right? They couldn't get away with this because she wouldn't agree to rules that allowed them to have this kind of power. We all talked about this when we went through 15 rounds of voting on McCarthy. He gave in to the far right, and you make your dance partner. And then you're stuck with that dance partner, where that dance partner steps on your toes, kicks you in the privates, does all that. That's where you are.
You dance, you pay the band, right?
Yeah, there you go.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, who is Hamas, the militant group behind the incursion into Israel that has sparked another war in the Middle East? We're going to speak to Nathan Brown, an expert on the region at George Washington University. That is next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.